Hi. Novation just refreshed their entire range of LaunchKey controllers. These Mark IV keyboards have a new design, are available in 6 different configurations, have new endless encoders, and can be used either as standalone controllers for hardware or software synths, with a generative arpeggiator, chord banks, and scale modes, or alongside DAWs with new integration features with Ableton Live, Logic, and others. In this video, I'll take a look at the differences between the various versions and what they can do, both standalone and alongside a DAW. I'll also take a look at pros and cons compared to the competition. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Novation sent me these controllers. Other than that, no money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, let's start with an overview. There are 6 new LaunchKey Mark IVs in 3 different tiers: Premium, Compact, and Mini. They share a lot of common capabilities, but let's start by looking at how they're different. On the lower end and less expensive side are the mini key versions with 25 keys and a first for Novation launch keys, 37 keys. This tier also has touch strips for pitch bend and modulation, as opposed to physical wheels on the others. And they've got fewer transport and workflow buttons. Buttons you'll find on the non-mini key versions are stop, loop, quantize, metronome, undo, and shift redo, capture MIDI. So these don't exist at all on the mini key versions, and some buttons like the track change keys are shift functions here. The pads and encoders are also smaller and more tightly packed on the mini key tier. Then there's a second tier called Compact, also 25 and 37 keys, this time with full-size keys, physical mod wheel and pitch bends, and the additional buttons. And then on the higher end is the third tier called Premium with bigger keybeds, 49 and 61 keys, a more premium feeling semi-weighted keybed, and 9 additional faders and 9 additional track buttons that you won't find on the lower tiers. The bigger keybeds also let you create MIDI splits and layers. So that's how these are all different. Other than that, the 3 tiers have quite a lot in common. Let's go through how they're alike. Just to make sure we're on the same page, all of these are MIDI controllers. They don't make any sounds on their own. You need to connect them to a hardware synth, a software synth, or a computer or tablet. Then in terms of controls, they have a lot in common. They all have 8 endless encoders for parameter controls. I think this is a big deal compared to the previous generation of LaunchKey controllers, the Mark IIIs, which had pot knobs. This means you don't need to mess with jumping parameters or pickup modes. You can swap different functions, and then when you go back to controlling what you controlled previously, you'll just pick up where you left off. On all 3 tiers, the encoders and pads have different modes. They're labeled on the panel, so these are all the encoder modes, for example, controlling the mixer, or controlling plugins. Then the pads also have various modes, for example, controlling clips on your DAW, drums, chord modes, custom modes, and so on. More on that later. Sometimes the pads or the encoders will control different groups of parameters, for example, different clips on Ableton Live, or parameters. So, for example, on this track, I've only got a few parameters mapped, but if I go to this track, you'll see a little arrow light up here. So it's off on this track, but it's on this track. This means we can move ahead to different groups of parameters for the plugin that's on that track. The encoders aren't touch encoders, so you can't preview their value or what it is they're controlling simply by touching them. However, if you want to see that without changing them, you can hold Shift, then turn the encoder, and you'll see its value without changing it, and then you can go ahead and change parameters if you want. By the way, if you hold Shift, depending on your mode, some things might light up on the panel to give you an indication that they can do something with Shift. Moving on with the similarities, all the Mark IV controllers also have 16 velocity and pressure sensitive pads. They all work quite well, I think. This is another example of a case where you can bank up and down to control different drums within a kit. Like I mentioned, they've got different modes, for example, various chord modes, which we'll talk about. You can also perform with them with polyphonic aftertouch. These 2 buttons also have different functions based on the pad mode. Another unique characteristic of all three that I was surprised with initially, when I plugged these into my computer, it identified them as keyboards. And that's because you can program them to send keystrokes, like DAW or program shortcuts. More on that later. And then all three have a built-in arpeggiator, different chord modes and scale modes, and their functionality is identical across all tiers. In terms of build, all the controllers have a plastic enclosure, but it feels very stable without bends or creaks. I won't read the weight specs out to you, but they all feel very light and portable. Okay, let's dive in a little bit deeper, and I'll start with the Keybeds. In terms of feel, there is a difference between the premium keybed and the middle tier full-size keys, but I wouldn't call it night and day. Velocity sensitivity is better on this keybed compared to this one, but there's good bounce on both. These do have a bit more of a piano-like feel, but they're semi-weighted, not fully weighted, and an octave is about 5 millimeters bigger on the premium tier versus the middle tier. Then on the mini key side, the keys are quite small. Not all mini keys are created equally. I'm going to use the metric system, I hope you don't mind. They're only 8 centimeters deep, as opposed to 9 centimeters on Keybeds by Arturia or Yamaha. And then a full octave C2C is similar to Yamaha's Reface mini keys, but about 1 centimeter smaller than Arturia keys, which makes a difference, both that and the depth. The keys are velocity sensitive, but quite spongy and have a relatively short travel distance down. None of the keybeds, by the way, have aftertouch. Now, one advantage that the lower tier keybeds have is the keybed height over the desktop and overall height. The mini key version keys are only 2.5 centimeters above the desk. The mid-tier keys are 4.5 centimeters above the desk, and the keys on the larger keybeds are about 5 centimeters above the desk and about 9.5 centimeters total height, including the faders. So these are quite chunky. If you're playing them on your desk, you might have to lift your hands a bit. And if you've got them below your desk, you'll need a pretty tall drawer, relatively speaking. In terms of connectivity, all three tiers are almost identical. They're all powered by USB-C and only USB-C. They can send MIDI data over USB as well as keystrokes. All three have a sustain pedal input. They also all have a MIDI output to connect to hardware synths, but it's 5-pin MIDI for the full-size key versions, as opposed to a 3.5 millimeter mini jack for the mini keyboards, and they don't come with a dongle or MIDI adapter. None of the controllers switch off totally, but if you hold Shift in settings, it'll turn off the pads. So you can leave the computer and go to sleep a little bit more guilt-free. Okay, so those are the three tiers in terms of physical differences and similarities. Let's dig in and look at their built-in smarts, the arpeggiator, chord modes, and scale modes. All three modes are built into the processor in the keyboards, so you can use them with a DAW or software or hardware instrument you can connect these to. Let's start with the arpeggiator. When you press the ARP button, you'll see the 8 basic ARP functions. Each of these represents an encoder, and Shift and ARP will latch the arpeggiator. Let's quickly go through these. BPM controls the tempo, swing, both negative and positive, relative rate, gate length, types, the usual suspects. Let's go for 2 octaves, maybe a higher tempo. Okay. Random. Chord. And strum is an interesting one. Use the mod wheel to strum the chord. And then you've got mutate and rhythm, or deviate as it was per the older LaunchKeys. Deviate will add rests, and you can see the pattern here or here. So add rhythm to the pattern. And then mutate randomizes the ARP pattern every time you turn the mutate knob, and freezes the randomization when you stop turning the knob. The more you mutate, the more you'll incorporate notes that are outside the core pattern you played. First octave transpositions, then fifths, and then increasingly anything goes. And you can also filter these notes through a scale. We'll get to that in a bit. So those are the basic 8 parameters. And then there's an ARP pattern mode. So you can be in DAW mode, drum mode, user chord mode, but also in ARP pattern mode. And then the 2 rows of pads have different functions. The top row will show you the deviate pattern. And you can customize this if you want. And then the bottom row has 3 functions based on the function button. So you can tie notes, add accents, and add ratchets. By the way, on the mini key versions, there's no shortcut for ARP pattern. You can still reach it with a long press on the ARP button. A bonus feature, by the way, for the larger keybeds, you can choose to send the arpeggiator to just one of the parts in a split. Okay, let's move on from the arpeggiator and look at the second bit of built-in tech in these, and that's the various chord modes. Fixed chord is what you may be used to seeing from other keybeds. You hold fixed chord, play a chord, and then that chord gets transposed across the keybed. The mini keys, by the way, don't have a fixed chord button, but you can access that functionality with shift and scale. Then the next chord mode is user chord. You access that with shift and pressing this pad. This mode lets you program 16 chords into each of the pads. Right now, nothing is programmed in, but that can be easily fixed by holding a pad, playing a chord, and now this pad plays that chord. Then I can program another chord, then another one, and I've got a chord with a pad in the background. Let's maybe turn that pad off for now. You can program up to 6 notes. If you have a chord you don't like, you can delete it. You can transpose the chords. And then the third chord option or mode is chord map mode. Again, this exists on all 3. What this does is turn the launch keys into a mega MIDI chord pack. When you enter chord map mode, you'll see the pads light up. 8 blue or light blue pads and 8 orange pads. Each of these plays a different chord. These are called a bank. And you can see the chord name here on screen. And then you've got 40 of these banks. They're spread out in 5 adventure groups, kind of like an x-axis, and 8 explore banks. You can also look at these as folders. So 5 folders of 8 subfolders, each with different chords. And these are all subject to the scale. So if I choose, say, C minor, I'll get different chords. So these 2 knobs let you travel around the different chord banks. And then this knob will spread the chord out. And this knob will cause it to be strummed. And then the 6 orange pads on the right let you perform the chords in different ways. So, for example, ARP up and down will arpeggiate the chord for every time you press a key. Same goes for ARP down. And you can also spread the chord out. Then these will play different inversions. Also can be spread out or strummed. And these are odd ones. A bit quirky and odd, but these might send you on a creative exploration. So those are the chord modes and the arpeggiator. Then scales will lock the keyboard into whatever scale it is that you choose here. These encoders control the scales. So you can choose the root note of the scale and the type of scale. By default, LaunchKey will snap any note that's out of the scale to the scale, but if you move to filter out of scale mode, This is for those of you that enjoy self-inflicted pain. LaunchKey will just ignore notes that are outside the scale. And then there's easy mode, which plays the scale on the white keys, and the black keys don't do anything. Okay, let's move on and talk about DAW integrations. Novation has developed scripts for Ableton Live, Logic, Cubase, Reason, FL Studio, as well as Huey support for other DAWs. Let's take a look at features that are common to all DAWs and then explore a few interesting Ableton Live specific features. Let's start with the encoders. They've got a few modes like we talked about earlier: plugin mode, mixer mode, sends, and transport. In plugin mode, they control the parameters of whatever is the active device. So for example, here it's the Strum-O-Matic, and remember, you can use Shift to take a look at which parameter each encoder controls, or just turn the encoder to see what happens. If the device has more than 8 parameters, you'll see this little arrow light up. So this controls page 1, this controls page 2 of parameters, and even more beyond that. For Ableton Live, by the way, you can move between devices like this with Shift and the arrows. There's no device lock option though, unfortunately. Hopefully they'll add that. Anyway, that more or less is plugin mode. Then mixer mode lets you use the encoders to control the level of tracks, or if you press the down arrow, panning. So you've got that control for multiple tracks. Then sends mode lets you guessed it, control sends and use the down arrow for additional sends. And then transport mode lets you navigate around your timeline. So let's see what we've got here. Playback position, zoom in horizontally, then zoom out or in vertically on the track, set the loop start, and there's also loop end, and yeah, loop start, loop end, works nicely. Marker select also shows the marker name on screen, which is useful. And then this does nothing, and this controls the tempo. The track buttons let you move up and down or left and right between tracks, and Shift moves around in groups. And then on the larger controllers, the faders control levels or volume as expected. These buttons let you arm or unarm tracks in arm mode, and then in track select mode, you can use them to select tracks. This fader, by the way, controls the master level, master volume. And then as far as the pads go, I already showed you drum mode for pads. And then in DAW mode, things start to get interesting. With Ableton Live, you've got 2 DAW modes, clip mode and sequencer mode. Let's start with clip mode. That's pretty self-explanatory for those of you familiar with Ableton Live. You've got a window that you can move about the grid, and then the RGB pads will light up based on the color of the clips in the grid. You can launch individual clips or record into the red ones, into the empty ones. You can launch entire scenes. Move to the next scene. And then if you want, you can allocate the bottom row of pads to one of 3 functions: stop, mute, and solo. As you may have guessed, stop will stop clips, and then mute will mute tracks, and solo will solo one or more tracks if you want. And then something brand new for the launch keys, still with Ableton Live, all LaunchKey Mark IV tiers can now step sequence into Ableton Live's MIDI tracks. This works a little bit differently depending on whether you're sequencing into a melodic track or a drum track. Let's start maybe with drum tracks. This is pretty easy to use. You enter DAW mode sequencer. You can see that there's still no clips on the grid. It's an empty project, but the minute that I choose something and then put a few notes down, we've got a beat going, and it's pretty easy to step sequence this way. And it's important to note, this sequence lives directly in Ableton Live, not on the controller. Let's take a look at the clip we just created. So I could now go ahead and add snares. And you'll notice that as I mess around with this, trying to make a coherent beat, all the changes are immediately reflected in the clip. So unlike some controllers where you sequence on the controller and then can transfer the clip onto live, everything happens here in real time in live. Pretty cool. So you've got a step view for each of the elements in your kit. And then melodic sequencing is a bit different because whether you play a note or a chord, it all lives on a single pad. You either hold a pad and play a chord, or play a chord and then press a pad. Oh. And we should be able to see all those notes in our clip. Holding function lets you duplicate a pad. Function and arrow down duplicates the clip and copies it. And there's of course nothing preventing you from playing live into a pattern. Not my finest work, and not that you'd want to, but you could continue to duplicate this and make changes. Now this is quite a clip we've made for ourselves. You can navigate between the different bars to edit different parts of it. Anyway, this tune is pretty rigid and robotic. A lot of it is because whatever I played and entered manually into the sequencer was entered at the same velocity and at the same spot. Luckily, you can long press steps and change their velocity or their length, fine-tune their length, or nudge them around. And if you want to try out different ideas and select a different clip, you can hold this button and choose a different clip, and it'll jump right into that without exiting step sequencing mode. So that's it for Ableton Live. The launch keys are also optimized to work with other DAWs like Cubase, FL Studio, and Logic. Check out the documentation for more information. Okay, let's move on and take a look at the custom modes. These let you customize the MIDI or keyboard commands that the encoders, pads, and faders send out so that you can control specific parameters within your hardware or software synths or send different keyboard shortcuts to your computer. All three tiers let you create 4 different templates for the knobs, 4 different templates for the pads, and the larger controllers let you create custom templates for their extra faders and buttons. You edit these mappings using the components software, and then you can get the custom mode from the launch key itself. Right now I'm talking to this one, so we can customize the encoders and pads. We'll check out the faders and buttons in a bit. Anyway, you load up the encoders, one of the 4 modes. You can edit each of the encoders. For example, give it a name so that you know what it does. Choose the message type, CC, minimum, maximum values, and MIDI channel, and then just send it over. We've now successfully made our first mapping. Let's take a look at pad mappings. Again, let's choose one, say number 3. There are a few defaults here, by the way, but you can customize these to whatever you want. So let's say change this one to, let's see how far I can push my luck here. Anyway, pads are special because they can be not only control change type, but all of these, including keystrokes. So for example, if you want to use these pads to browse presets, you can assign a down arrow to a pad. Or if you want to quick save a project, you can assign Command S. Let's also change this color and then send this to mode 3. And if I hit this, it should save my live set. Then finally, let's take a look at faders and buttons. On the large format launch keys, faders can be assigned to CCs or NRPNs. And then these buttons can also be keystrokes or any one of these items. While we're on the topic of the bigger launch keys, let's take a look at splits and layers. So by default, you're playing part A, which is color coordinated here. I can move to play part B, which sends notes on a different channel. I can set up a split. You can set your own split point and then send notes on different channels, or set up a layer to send notes to both channels. You set these channels in the settings. You choose a channel for part A and a channel for part B. Speaking of settings, let's take a look at what we've got in here. You can choose the MIDI channel for the keyboard, either with these buttons or by pressing the pads. Then choose the MIDI channel for the chord modes, MIDI channel for the drums, and then a whole bunch of other settings, which I won't go through one by one, but I think you get the idea. Then finally, the Keybeds come with a content bundle shown on screen. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons compared to the competition, and I'll start with what's new compared to the Mark III launch keys, because in a way they compete too. One of the biggest improvements is that the knobs are now endless encoders and not pots, which is a good thing, since you'll constantly be changing different parameters with them based on whatever it is you choose to do. I'd also say that the creative aspects of the arpeggiator and chord banks and modes are a significant improvement. And then the DAW integration is better than on the Mark III, in particular, the step sequencer. Regarding the screen, it's nice that it's relatively high-res OLED as opposed to the two-line character LCD display on the previous Mark III versions. It's also great that it's in the middle on the larger keybeds as opposed to off on the side. And it's nice that it shows graphics and all, but it certainly is still very small. Then the pads are different and feel better, I think, on this generation. Then as far as specific models go, the minis now have a 37 key option as well as a screen, which means that other than the fewer buttons and faders, you get the same pad and knob feature set, including the arpeggiator, the chord modes, the scales, the DAW integration, including even the step sequencer. So in Mark IV, the mini keys are much less second-class citizens compared to the previous version. Then on the large/premium side, the Mark IV controllers now get a better keybed, semi-weighted keys, with splits and layers. So those are the differences versus the previous generation of launch keys. How do these fare versus the competition? If you're looking for a budget keyboard controller for Ableton Live, these are the best game in town. If you're not on a budget, by the way, the Novation's own SL Mark III is worth a look. Then regardless of Ableton Live, the built-in generative arpeggiator, chord modes, and scales are fun additions that also fare well competitively. The generative mutations on the arpeggiator are very well implemented, I think, and the different chord banks, I think, an excellent source for inspiring chord combinations. And the fact that you can customize your own templates, which now include keystrokes, expands what these controllers can do even further. So those are the pros. On the cons side, unlike some of its competitors, the screen here is very small. So on some of its competitors, you don't need to squint to see the track name or instrument. And even better, some of its competitors have either a screen per knob or a big screen that shows you what each knob does. Though not at this price range, same goes for capacitive touch. Some other controllers have that, but again, not at this price range. Like I mentioned, you can do that here with Shift, but that's an extra step. The encoders are also fairly tightly packed, especially on the mini key versions. There's also no aftertouch on any of these keybeds if that's important to you, and the mini keys are particularly small compared to controllers by other companies like Arturia. And then if you're working a lot with instrument libraries from Arturia or Native Instruments, then those controllers have a better integration for browsing and performance with those instruments, though of course you could create manual mappings to control software by those companies. Other than that, I do have a couple of requests on the firmware side. It would be great if you could send the chords through the arpeggiator. You can't do that currently, though you can of course turn on the arpeggiator in your DAW or plugin and send the chords through that to arpeggiate them. Other than that, there's no device lock option here. It would be nice if you could lock controls to a particular device regardless of where you are on the grid. Then I have one final request for Novation. I think the feature set on the control portion of the launch keys is brilliantly implemented. It's compact and convenient, but some of us may want aftertouch, poly aftertouch, or fully weighted keys, and actually may already have those keybeds around the house. So could you please make a small compact desktop unit that's just this part of the controller without the keys? Because I'm about to void my warranty. So that's it for Novation's Mark IV line of controllers. If you like the insights in this video, there are plenty more that don't require injuring your gear in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.